Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this summit. It's very important to me. It comes at a critical time in Aotearoa when so many of our policy advances are being taken away or eroded. And so I'm very hopeful that what comes out of this summit will be actions, advocacy, ideas that people will take on board and actually influence change. So I'm going to draw on research, which comes from a paper that I wrote with Aisling Gallagher from Massey University, and you can see it on the Kindergarten's Aotearoa website. It's called Principles and Approaches to Early Childhood Funding. I was asked to talk about early childhood as a public good, why investment in public early childhood education is essential, and also look at a system for early childhood funding, how it might be structured, and critical elements for a funding for the future. So it's rather a tall order. Next slide, please. So just talking about quality early childhood education, I think we need to emphasize that it is quality, is a human right and a public good. And that came from the United Nations. It underpins the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It's based on understanding that benefits of education include and go beyond individuals. They encompass collective benefits for the good of society and also, I would say, for life on Earth. They affirm education as a site for social cohesion, which we've just been listening to ideas about that, and I think for democratic practice, and also that we all in our community bear responsibility for education. So UNESCO has done a lot looking at the principle of education as a public good. So it uses that idea to advocate for adequate public funding for education, to argue for inclusion, that education, quality education should be available for all, and to reaffirm the role of the state as the main duty bearer in ensuring the right to education. So it implies a major role for the state in provision and funding of educational opportunities. And the quote, I think it's really important to think about the purpose of early childhood education as a public good. And that quote on the PowerPoint is the vision for 2020 of a group of national early childhood community-based organisations. So I'm not going to read it. You can have a look at that. And yet there has been very little public discussion about what early childhood should be for. Instead, what we have in current government debates is captured by a view of early childhood. I used the term economic merit good, which I hope is correct, that the idea that it generates a return on investment. It's childcare for working families. It's policy that privileges markets over state actions and individualism over the common good. And so we've seen that in the really dismaying changes that have been made very quickly under this current government. And I think that's been talked about quite a bit already. So next slide, please. There's a lot of research over many years that has shown on average for-profit provision is rated lower on indicators of quality. It offers poorer staff working conditions and pay. It employs lower levels of qualified teachers, and it offers more restricted access than community-based and public provision. And that book there on the PowerPoint slide is an edited book with case studies, which concluded that marketisation and privatisation risk deepening, consolidating, or widening inequalities of access to early childhood provision, and also driving qualitative differences between types of providers. So next slide, please. Corporatisation, where shareholders include international corporate companies and private equity groups, which we heard a lot about from Abigail, and I thought that was amazing. The very detailed information she had about the impacts of this. They're an alarming feature of New Zealand's early childhood provision. So Busy Bees Childcare is the third largest provider of education and care centres in Aotearoa. It has 75 centres. It's a global company. It's got over 400 nurseries in Europe and 850 early childhood settings. It's the largest nursery provider in the UK. The majority shareholder is the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. So early childhood is seen as a lucrative source of income for this investment company. Busy Bees has been exposed and researched by the United Workers Union in Australia for paying absolutely exorbitant salaries to owners and executives, and also avoiding tax by paying the parent company offshore and registering a debt. Evolve, which Abigail also spoke about, is the second largest company in New Zealand. It owns 111 education and care centres in New Zealand, and it's owned by an Australian private equity company. Next slide, please. I did a study with forensic accountant Vida Boats and academic Olivera Karmanarik, where we compared Evolve and Whānau Manaaki kindergartens. They're on similar size in terms of the number of centres or kindergartens that they manage. And I've just got some of the findings up there on the board. Evolve centres on average were significantly lower on ERO ratings of how well placed they were to promote positive learning outcomes. Board member backgrounds were mainly male, ethnically homogenous, business-oriented, compared with Whānau Manaaki kindergartens, which were democratically elected. They represented the diverse community. Evolve spent 62% of total revenue on staffing, compared with Whānau Manaaki kindergartens, 91% of total revenue on staffing. And that's so similar to the differences found in the UCL report, and indicates where money is being made for profit. It's the biggest cost in teacher-led early childhood. And you can make it cheap, you can make early childhood cheaper and make profits by employing fewer qualified staff and fewer staff. So next slide, please. Also, what Abigail talked about, early childhood services and their properties are lucrative investment companies. That's an advertisement in Hamilton, Flagstaff Childcare, how prosperous it is to buy up early childhood centres, and particularly it references the lesser regulations that make it even more profitable. So on the next slide, I'm just going to look at the advantages for the community good in publicly provided and community-based early childhood. And these have come from the research and our thinking about it. So it's a public resource, it's a community asset. It's centred on the best interests of the child and the family. And so the full funding from public resources goes into educating the child and supporting the family. It also incorporates projects of public value, further projects. And there are many examples that I've researched and seen operating in community-based centres where the operation is extended to offer holistic support and opportunities for participation of families, whānau, and the wider community. And those are particularly in what we call integrated early childhood models. They're democratically accountable to the community through their structures, governance, decision-making. Education is seen as a collective responsibility. There's opportunities for participation of a wide group of teachers, whānau, community. They enrich responsiveness and solidarity. And I've ended there with a quote from Gunilla Dahlberg, Peter Moss, and Alan Pence, who say that early childhood institutions that operate purely as businesses are situated in the economic sphere. They can't also be forums in civil society. Okay, next slide. So in our paper and for the work that we did with Kindergarten's Aotearoa, we looked at different models of funding and different mechanisms to deliver funding. And a common distinction is made between supply side funding and demand side funding. So demand side funding is funding the user. It involves funding going directly to parents, caregivers, to help with expenditure on early childhood and supposedly to help them decide what early childhood they would like to attend. And Abigail also spoke about that. It's usually in one of three forms: tax breaks, vouchers, parent subsidies. So Family Boost is a demand-side funding subsidy in New Zealand, which we know has been fraught with problems. Fewer parents, caregivers applied for it in the first place. The rebate comes retrospectively, not when the family needs the money. It makes government planning more difficult because they don't know what money is coming in. Families who are not in paid employment miss out. So they reinforce that idea that early childhood, the purpose is mainly to provide care for children of families in paid employment rather than a universal education service. Supply side funding or funding the service involves government funding provided directly to early childhood education with conditions attached. And this is what we mainly have. I've listed them up there on the board. An OECD report of 20 countries said direct public funding of services brings more effective control, advantages of scale, better national quality, more effective training for educators, and a higher degree of equity in access and participation than demand-side models. So that's a really positive feature of our funding system, but it's not enough. The proviso is that we also need strong regulations and planning services to make sure that early childhood education is available in every community. So government also needs to provide funding at adequate levels, and it needs to be indexed so that it doesn't lose its value, as we've seen in the last budget round where we got that minuscule percentage increase in funding. I think it should be targeted for spending purposes, and it should not be able to be siphoned off for corporate profits. We have unbelievably weak accountability requirements. There's no restriction or monitoring of fees that are charged. There's no required accountability to the wider community. There's no requirements on how funding is spent, and there's no control on profits. So regulatory and accountability requirements need to support quality and access. Next slide, please. And this was some ideas about a funding model, which we'll also see in the Kindergarten's Aotearoa website and further information from Kindergarten's Aotearoa. It's based on a vision for children and families and cost factors. So the idea is that funding is divided into three components: staffing, operations, advisory, and support. As an overall principle, a single funding model would be applied, but the weightings of the cost factors would differ for different types of service. And I just want to highlight staffing because that has come up as such a significant issue in debate in New Zealand and obviously also in Australia. So over 40 years of research evidence shows that the powerful positive relationship between a well-educated early childhood qualified teaching workforce with high quality early childhood and interactions that benefit children. And it also shows that low quality environments are actively bad for children. The formula would include a requirement that funding is spent on staffing in teacher-led services. So the suggestion is a negotiation of a national collective employment agreement with the Secretary of Education as a party, staff paid through a central payroll to ensure a qualified teaching workforce with pay parity and supportive working conditions. These could not be undermined under this model, and they would be a reasonably straightforward thing to administer. So money intended for staffing couldn't be siphoned off for private or investor profit. The final slide, please. Okay, so this is a big, long wish list, really. I couldn't break it down to what should we immediately focus on. I think we absolutely need to plan provision instead of marketisation so that in every community there are services that meet the aspirations and needs of the families, whānau and community. We need to legislate an entitlement to a place in high quality early childhood. And I'd suggest it comes from the end of generous paid parental leave, like they have in the Nordic countries. Free quality early childhood education for all children is a much better way to ensure cost-free access and remove family boost. Cap and regulate fees. Many countries are now doing that. Canada is an example. And strong financial accountability. And I think we need to also investigate tax avoidance by organisations through registering a debt or registering as a charitable trust. Public funding for new early childhood in public and community-based sectors only. So that at the moment we have something like 65% of education and care centres are privately owned, and I think the way to change that balance is to have these strong accountability requirements and spending requirements, and also look to the future of new provision. Staff and whānau reps, full participants on early childhood decision-making bodies. And I've talked about the staffing component. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.